The day my mother demanded I hand over my dream home to my sister was the day I erased my family and chose freedom. I never thought the happiest day of my life would be the one that also cracked the last thread of my family ties. I was 34, newly moved into the house I'd spent nearly a decade dreaming about, a 3-bedroom, sun-drenched slice of heaven just outside the city, not too far from work but far enough to breathe. My wife Kayla 31F and I had worked for everything, long nights, skipped vacations, second jobs, and still we scraped every cent to make the down payment. I remember the morning we got the keys, she cried. I laughed. We collapsed on the floor of the empty living room and promised we'd never let anything ruin this, but I didn't know back then how close we'd come, how fast poison spreads when it's rooted in your own blood. My mother Gloria 59F had always been the type of woman who mistook control for love. She wasn't physically cruel but she wrapped every favor with a string, every compliment with a jab. She had a way of making me feel like nothing I did was ever enough, unless it served her. My sister Tammy 35F wasn't much better. She followed in her footsteps like a shadow with a megaphone, always louder, always needier, always the victim. Tammy had married young to a guy named Dave 36M who started off lazy and then made a career out of it. He hadn't worked a steady job in years, spent most of his time glued to a gaming chair barking orders into a headset while Tammy managed their chaotic house of 6 kids like she was owed a medal for surviving it, and somehow, in their minds, that made them martyrs, and we were the villains for not bowing at their feet. It started subtly, as it always does. Tammy would call asking for help with groceries or rent, then came the babysitting demands, "Can you just take 2 of the kids for a weekend? It's so overwhelming, please." We said yes more often than we should have, out of guilt, out of some twisted sense of duty. Even though Kayla was working night shifts and I was juggling overtime, we tried to help, and they took that as an invitation to ask for more, until the day the phone rang and my mother's voice, sweet as venom, dropped the question that flipped my entire world upside down. She wanted our house, not temporarily, not as a crash pad, but as a full transfer of ownership. She said Tammy and her struggling family needed it more than we did, said that as the son it was my moral obligation to provide, that Kayla and I were still young and childless, we could bounce back, start fresh somewhere else. She even suggested we move in with her for a while until we found our feet again, as if we hadn't bled for every tile, every inch of drywall in that place, as if our life, our peace, was a casual luxury she could auction off for her favorite daughter's convenience. I laughed at first, I really did, because it felt like a joke, a dark one, but when I realized she was serious, when I saw that Tammy had already scoped out our neighborhood, visited the local school for her kids, made plans without even consulting us, my hands went cold. Kayla stood behind me, silent, waiting to see if I'd finally stand up to them. I didn't say anything on that call, just hung up. And that silence became the wedge that cracked everything. The days after were a blur of manipulation. Tammy texted me crying about how hard life was. My mother left voicemails accusing me of turning my back on family. Distant relatives chimed in too, saying blood was thicker than deeds. Kayla stayed calm, didn't pressure me, but I could see it wearing her down, the fear, the frustration, the rage she buried behind those tired eyes. It killed me, because for years I had shielded them, defended them, made excuses for their behavior, but now they were clawing at the one thing I had built with my own hands and calling it love. I finally cracked the day Tammy showed up unannounced with her kids. Dave wasn't even with her. She stood in our driveway with bags in hand, looking at me like I was the hotel clerk and this was her reservation. She actually said, "So where should we set up the cribs?" Like it was already settled, like my silence had been a yes, and something inside me broke so quietly it almost felt peaceful. I told her to leave, no yelling, no theatrics, just a cold, steady voice I didn't recognize as my own. She screamed. She called our mother, who showed up 10 minutes later with righteous fury burning in her eyes, accusing Kayla of turning me against my own blood, telling me I'd regret this, that family doesn't forget betrayal. I didn't argue, I didn't justify. I just walked inside and locked the door behind them while they pounded on the glass like ghosts I'd finally exorcised. That was the last day I spoke to either of them. I blocked their numbers. Kayla changed the locks, we installed cameras, and for the first time in my life I felt free, like I could breathe without permission, like this house wasn't just walls and windows, it was proof that I had chosen my own peace over their poison, that I'd drawn a line and dared them to cross it, and when they did, I didn't flinch. But this was only the beginning. Cutting them off didn't silence them, it only turned their desperation into something darker, more calculated, more public. Within days I started receiving messages from extended family. People I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had plenty to say about what a disgrace I was, how Tammy was struggling to keep food on the table while we lounged in a 3-bedroom palace sipping wine and playing house. One of my cousins even had the gall to say that maybe Kayla and I couldn't have kids because we were being punished by God for our selfishness. I stared at that message until the rage inside me made my hands shake, not because it was cruel, but because it echoed the same toxic logic I had grown up with: pain as penance, sacrifice as currency, and if you didn't bleed for someone else, you didn't deserve happiness of your own. Kayla found me sitting in the dark with my phone glowing like a wound in my hand. She took it from me gently, read every word, then quietly deleted the entire app and said we were done giving them access to our peace. I didn't argue, I just nodded, because she was right. They weren't just trying to guilt me anymore, they were trying to dismantle me, brick by brick, until I gave them what they wanted or collapsed under the weight of refusing. But they underestimated how much I had changed. We had worked for everything, every dollar, every tile, every step of the staircase we climbed into our bedroom each night and whispered our dreams into, and I wasn't about to let years of sacrifice get bulldozed by a woman who treated her son like a wallet and a sister who thought motherhood was a free pass to entitlement. I started documenting everything, every message, every call, every threat. Because I knew people like them didn't stop, they regrouped, they escalated, and when that failed, they lied. 2 weeks later it happened. The police showed up at our door. Tammy had filed a false report claiming I had promised her tenancy in our home and had forcibly removed her children from the premises when she tried to move in. She had no proof, just her word and a few doctored texts I'd supposedly sent agreeing to let her stay. The officers were polite but firm, asking us to explain, and thankfully we had everything backed up. Kayla handed over the evidence, neatly organized, while I stood there breathing through my teeth trying not to let the betrayal crack open the years I'd spent swallowing it. They left without incident but warned me it might not be over. Family disputes rarely stayed clean, especially when children were involved. I nodded, thanked them, and closed the door again on a world I no longer recognized as mine, and in that silence I knew what I had to do, not just legally, but emotionally. I sat down and wrote a letter to my mother, the last thing I'd ever say to her. I told her that I loved her once, as a child loves unconditionally, blindly, but that the woman she had become had made that love a battlefield. I told her that Tammy was not my responsibility and never would be again, that her life choices were her own and I wouldn't bleed to fix them. I told her that I was done sacrificing my sanity on the altar of family, that this house was not just a structure, it was a boundary, and she had burned every bridge leading to it. Then I sealed it and mailed it. With no return address, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I needed the closure she would never willingly give. And still, even after that, she found a way to twist the knife. A mutual friend told me that Gloria had started telling people I was mentally unstable, that Kayla had isolated me, that I was spiraling and needed help, and Tammy, always eager to escalate, posted a long, dramatic message online about how her children had been denied a safe home by their cruel, heartless uncle who only cared about square footage and granite countertops. She included a picture of the house, blurring the number B. UT still showing enough to cause problems. I got threatening messages, uninvited guests driving by slowly, watching. Kayla wanted to move, I could see it in her eyes even though she didn't say it out loud, but I refused, because running meant they won, and I was done losing. I was done shrinking myself to make them comfortable, so we reinforced our security, installed better cameras, even talked to a lawyer about filing a restraining order if necessary, and through all of it I kept working, kept building, kept living. Because that's how you win against people who feed on your destruction, you starve them with success. Then the final blow came not from them but from an unexpected place. Dave, Tammy's husband, messaged me. Not to apologize, not to fix things, but to demand money. He said he knew things had gone too far, but that Tammy was emotional and my mother was old, and couldn't I be the bigger man and just give them a small loan to get a place of their own. He even offered to write up a repayment plan, said he was working on a gaming channel and just needed a launch pad to get started. I stared at that message for 10 minutes, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was so stunned by how utterly divorced from reality they were, how deeply entitled, how thoroughly brainwashed into thinking I owed them anything. I deleted it without replying, blocked him, then added one more lock to the door. And for the first time in my life, I felt safe. There's a strange calm that settles over you when you finally burn the last bridge and feel no urge to swim back. It's not peace exactly, it's more like clarity, like the static is gone and you can hear yourself think. For the first time in years, Kayla and I started living again, not just existing. We spent mornings in our backyard drinking coffee, watching the sky change. We painted the guest room a soft blue and filled it with books and quiet, not because we expected company, but because we were allowed to have silence without guilt. And for a while, the storm outside our walls seemed to lose interest. But then came the envelope. It arrived with no return address, slid under our front door while we were out. I found it when we got back from grocery shopping, thick, creased, stained with something that looked like coffee or old tears. Inside were photos, printed ones, not digital, grainy but unmistakable. Tammy and her kid sitting on a stained mattress in what looked like a rundown motel, Dave on the floor beside them, gaming headset still on. A box of instant noodles in the corner, no context, no letter, just misery. Raw and curated, as if suffering was currency they expected me to convert into pity and payments. I showed Kayla. She didn't say anything for a long time, then she just shook her head and said, "They're still trying to use your guilt like a leash," and she was right. It wasn't even about the house anymore, or the money, or even the lies. It was about control, and how badly they needed me to fold just once so they could unravel everything again. I didn't respond, didn't acknowledge it, but something in me twisted, not out of sympathy, but out of recognition, because I had seen this tactic before, lived through it as a kid, when my mother would cry about bills in front of me but never in front of Tammy, when she'd guilt me into selling my bike so Tammy could get a new dress for prom, when she'd make me feel like love was a scoreboard and I was always 5 points behind. This envelope was the same trick in a new costume, and I was done playing the fool. But cutting people off doesn't mean they disappear, it just means they circle back louder, meaner, more desperate, and the next time it wasn't a photo or a message, it was an appearance. Tammy showed up at my office. She walked in like she owned the place, dragging 2 of her kids behind her, asking the receptionist for me by name, saying she needed to see her brother urgently. I got the alert on my phone from the front desk camera and felt my stomach turn to stone. I told security not to let her through, then watched from the window as she argued, then begged, then finally sat on the floor with her kids and cried loud enough for half the building to hear. She didn't leave until the cops arrived, and even then she screamed that I was a heartless monster, that I was destroying a family, that I was leaving innocent children on the street. And as much as I hated how it made me look, I didn't flinch, because I knew that behind those tears was calculation, a twisted theater meant to soften me just enough to give her what she wanted, and I was no longer available for manipulation. My boss called me in that evening, not to reprimand me, but to check if everything was okay. I told him the truth, or most of it, and he listened, nodded, told me to take a few days off if I needed to. I didn't, but it felt good to be believed, to not be treated like the villain just because I was trying to protect the life I'd fought to build. Back home Kayla had already changed the locks again, just in case. She was calmer than I was, quieter, but I knew it was weighing on her too, the pressure, the unpredictability, the way our home was slowly becoming a fortress instead of a sanctuary. I held her that night longer than usual, whispered promises I wasn't sure I could keep but needed to say anyway, and for a while we just breathed together, matching rhythms in a world determined to break our sync. Then came the letter from our lawyer. Tammy and Gloria had filed a civil suit. They were suing for emotional distress, claiming I had reneged on a verbal agreement to share the house, claiming I had intentionally misled them into believing they'd have a place to live, and that my rejection had resulted in psychological harm to the children. I laughed when I read it, actually laughed, because it was so absurd it felt like satire, but it was real, and it meant going to court, hiring a better attorney, digging up every message, every lie, every act of sabotage and manipulation, and laying it bare for strangers to see. Kayla looked at me, wide-eyed, and said, "Are we really doing this?" And I told her, "Yes, we are, because they've mistaken silence for weakness, and I'm done letting them weaponize my kindness. We started collecting everything, screenshots, emails, records of the police visits, everything we could use to show the pattern, the abuse, the history, and slowly, steadily, we built a wall of truth taller than any lie they could throw over it. But even with all of that, there was still one thing left to say. So I wrote a statement, not for court, but for myself. I stood in the kitchen, the place we loved most, where the light hit the floor just right and the smell of coffee always felt like a promise, and I read it aloud to Kayla, every word, every wound, every line I'd drawn in the sand, and when I finished, she walked over, kissed my forehead, and said, "It's not just your story anymore, it's ours, and we're writing the ending together." And I believed her. Even if the fight wasn't over yet, the courtroom was cold, not physically, but emotionally, like the air had been filtered through 7 layers of tension and expectation. Gloria sat on one side with Tammy and a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Tammy had dressed the kids in wrinkled uniforms, clearly a move for pity, while Gloria whispered in her ear like a director coaching her star actor before curtain call. Kayla squeezed my hand under the table, calm and steady, a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone in this anymore, and when it came time to speak, I didn't falter. I told the truth, not the dramatic version, not the version bent for sympathy, just the truth, clean and direct. I laid out every text, every voicemail, every uninvited visit, every threat wrapped in a guilt trip, the police report, the footage, the timestamps, the screenshots, all of it, and when I finished, the judge looked over the pile of paper and asked one simple question: what exactly do the plaintiffs believe they are owed? The silence that followed was heavier than anything I've ever heard, because for the first time, Gloria and Tammy realized that pity wasn't a currency in that room, facts were, and they had none. The case was dismissed, not just dismissed, but rebuked. The judge called it a misuse of the legal system and warned them that any further harassment could result in a restraining order. Kayla and I didn't smile, we didn't gloat, we just stood, gathered our things, and walked out, because it wasn't a victory, not really, it was just the final chapter in a book we'd been forced to finish so we could finally start another. But they didn't give up easily. A week after the verdict, someone egged our house, then came the calls from unknown numbers, hang-ups at 3 a.m., then the fake Yelp reviews on Kayla's private practice page, anonymous slanders accusing her of malpractice, calling her cold and unethical. We knew who it was, of course we did, but proving it wasn't easy. Still, we documented everything again, added it to the growing file labeled closure, and then something happened that we didn't expect. Dave reached out again. But this time, he wasn't begging. He was warning. He said Tammy was unraveling, that after losing the case she had spiraled, told her kids I had destroyed their lives, that Kayla had cast a spell on me, that everything bad that had ever happened to her was my fault. He said he was scared, not of me, but of her, of what she might do, and part of me wanted to ignore him, to let him drown in the mess he'd helped create, but I couldn't, not completely, because there were kids involved, and even if I owed Tammy nothing, they didn't deserve the collateral damage. So I made one final call. Not to Tammy, not to Gloria, but to CPS. I gave them everything, every piece of evidence, every erratic behavior, every incident that involved the kids being used as pawns or props or weapons. I didn't do it out of revenge, I did it because someone had to protect them, and clearly no one else was going to. I never heard what came of it directly, but a neighbor of theirs messaged me months later, told me Tammy and Dave had moved out suddenly, that the kids were staying with Gloria now, that there'd been some kind of investigation, and after that, the noise finally stopped. Kayla and I celebrated quietly, no parties, no announcements, just a long drive through the hills and a shared look that said, "It's over," and for once, it really was. No more banging on the door, no more voicemails, no more guilt masquerading as family. We kept the house, of course. Planted new flowers in the front yard, repainted the kitchen, and started talking about maybe expanding the guest room into a nursery, not because we had to, not because anyone expected it, but because we finally could, without fear, without obligation, without interference. I still get the occasional holiday card from extended relatives who hope we're doing well. I don't reply, not out of spite, but because some ghosts are best left unanswered, and when I think back on it all now, the house, the lawsuit, the betrayal, the chaos. I don't feel anger anymore, just relief because I chose peace over permission. And I've never looked back. So if you're wondering whether it's wrong to cut off your own blood to save your soul, let me be the one to tell you, it's not. Sometimes the hardest doors to close are the ones that lead back home, but once you do, once you lock it for good, the silence on the other side is worth everything. If you've ever had to make that choice, tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story too, and if this hit you anywhere deep, like, comment, and subscribe, because this channel is for the ones who chose peace, even when it cost them everything else. ScrollTales out.